How should you determine market value or after repaired value? For this discussion, we're going to call these synonymous. Making an offer on a property is not as simple as looking at other closed comparable sales in the area. Miscalculations of ARV have been the demise of a few wholesalers and many rehabbers. I'm Dave Dinkle, and I'm not an attorney, CPA, or realtor, and any information derived or found in this presentation is not to be construed as legal or accounting advice. For FTC purposes, there is no average if we discuss anything about students, just so you know ahead of time. For a little nostalgia, I thought I'd talk about for a moment what happened 50 years ago today. For 10 days in 1971, I was a guest speaker aboard Holland America's New Amsterdam. I spoke to a somewhat captive audience about financial planning and how to invest in stocks, bonds, and commodities. I worked for Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith at that time, which is now the company known as Merrill Lynch. To say something about how things change, the minimum wage at that time had just been increased to $1.90 an hour. By the way, my first real job prior to becoming a chemical engineer and a stockbroker, real estate investor later, was with Goody Shoes. I was paid 35 cents an hour, had to ride my bicycle 5 miles each way to work. But let's look now at today and look forward. Let's talk about the 6 traditional sources of determining value of any property. First of all and foremost is a professional licensed appraiser. They're trained extensively and tested by governing agencies to accurately determine the market value of a property. These appraisals can vary dramatically from appraiser to appraiser. I've been in situations where I've gotten 2 or 3 appraisals on the same property, same comparable sales, same neighborhood or subdivision. All 3 of them came in at different prices. So there is a value judgment somewhere along the line about what the market value is, even by an appraiser. I think the important thing about an appraiser is his or her limit of liability is the amount that you pay him or her. And I'm going to use the word him or his from here on out just for brevity. So if you pay him $300 for the appraisal and it comes back that the appraisal was way off and you decide to sue the appraiser, his limit of liability, which you sign in your contract when you sign him up, is $300. Keep that in mind. Now, appraisers are coveted by banks and lenders, but as a response to a seller telling you they got an appraisal for $300,000, what you should say is, I wish appraisers would be required to buy properties at their estimates. Because look, they simply do what's in the best interest of the client they have, which is always going to be the highest comparable sales. Some appraisers will look at condition of the property, especially the interior, and make a value judgment of how much it is to repair that. Some of them are now contractors under different state laws. Some have to be contractors before they can be appraisers. But in the real world, most of them are not familiar with what the real cost of a rehab would be. Bank of America is an unusual example, but it has its own salaried staff of appraisers. The idea being there's no chance of you coercing them into giving a higher appraisal by money or favoritism or anything else. So the only way to influence an appraiser's estimate is to include an estimate of repairs that you request that he turn in with his report. Very oftentimes new investors go out to meet the appraisal or the person doing the BPO, and they bring along with them comparable sales. If they're the seller, they're looking at the highest comps in the neighborhood and probably another neighborhood. That's not going to intimidate an appraiser. He has to do his job. He has to make a complete report. The only way he will be able to be influenced is if you have a contractor's estimate of repairs and ask him to include that in his report. Now the second thing is, believe it or not, tax assessed value as determined by the county. When we started investing in 1975, the MLS was still in its infancy, and it was just very difficult to figure out what the value of a property was, except to look in the public record and see what the tax assessed value was. And that's what we did. And we always felt that if we could buy at 50, 60, or 70% of tax assessed value, rehab it, and turn it back out into the market, we could get tax assessed value or higher. But as the markets fluctuated and went up dramatically, that became a nonsensical number to look at because the markets outpaced the tax assessor's reassessments. When markets declined, the same thing happened. The tax assessor couldn't reassess fast enough, and the huge wave of unrest with homeowners was, I'm paying too much in taxes and I can prove it. And in many cases they did. And for probably 3-4 years, maybe even 5 years, what happened is homeowners were contesting their taxes, getting credits because the market was falling, had fallen very quickly in 1 or 2 years. But the tax assessor didn't reassess properties except for every second or third year. So actually these values are reasonably accurate in normal markets. Now we've had a 12-year straight up market in real estate, and I should say they were reasonably accurate until probably about a year and a half ago when the market started to really take off. So they're a guideline, they're not cast in stone. Now the tax assessed value is different from what the taxable amount is because a homeowner can get various types of credits such as blindness, widows, homestead exemptions, and various things. In rapidly rising or declining markets, again, they lag the market, but it's only an indication of what's going on. Because the county wants all the tax revenue it's entitled to and more, every so often the county actually has appraisers reassess the market value of selected properties. They literally go out in the field. Sometimes you'll see them taking pictures of single-family homes or multifamily homes. And the question is, why are they doing that? They check in the public record to find out whether a structure was built on. Now then they take these recalculated values by the appraisers and they put them into a computer algorithm or software to get all of the non-commercial properties' new assessed values. They can't go out and appraise every property, but they can use software that more or less talks about how much everybody should have gone up at the same time. When you hear realtors or other news people talk about market values of single-family homes rose 6%, they did for ones that were sold, but did the ones that weren't sold go up? In the eyes of the tax assessor, they did. Now, these do not take into account any interior remodeling or condition of the property unless it can be seen from the exterior of the property. Appraisers for the county, for tax purposes, are not allowed to go inside the home. They have to be invited in, but it doesn't matter. They don't care about what the inside of the home looks like. Just as a side note, and something that's very important, if you're out at a property and you're doing a rehab and a code enforcement officer stops by, he may or may not walk into the property if the door is open. But if you hear a knock on the door and you run out and look out the front window and you see a code officer's car out there and you see him knocking on the door and you don't answer the door and he doesn't know you're in there, he's going to come back. But if you tell him, you don't have the right to come on my premises, you're wrong. Not only does he have the right, the next thing he's going to do is call a police officer and they're going to come on your premises. So if you've done something wrong, you've done work without a permit, let him in your property, allow him to come in your property and plead insanity or whatever you want to plead, but you're going to get caught and you're going to pay the consequences. If you handle it as a hardball, you're going to pay more consequences. While these tax assessed values should be used as a guideline, make sure you understand whether the county is using gross or net square footage to evaluate it. Now, why does it really matter? Net square footage is everything that's under an air conditioner if it had an air conditioner, and gross square footage is everything else. Screened-in porches, garage, decks, all kinds of sort of things. And if you work with a valuation model that multiplies the price per square foot of comparable sales, it needs to multiply it times the gross or the net, otherwise you're going to have an inflated value. It's very, very important. And if you said to me, well, Dave, who uses gross and who uses net? Different counties use different numbers and different states use different numbers. And some of them use two numbers, gross and net. But it's easy to find out which is which. So let's talk about the broker's price opinion. This is probably the most well-known thing in the industry. And it's simply a value estimate done by a real estate broker. He is typically paid $40 to $75 per BPO from a lender, and it's because the lender is too cheap to pay an appraiser. Now, before a loan is made on a property, a lender will in fact send an appraiser out. As I mentioned, Bank of America has their own salaried appraisers. However, on a short sale or on an REO or on a pre-foreclosure, what the lender does is he doesn't want to spend for an appraiser yet, so he emails an agent and he says, I need a BPO on 123 Main Street and I'm paying $50. And here are the forms. And typically their forms are pretty extensive. They ask the agent to decide whether the market's going up or down and so on and so forth. That BPO can be done from the comfort of the realtor's desk. Sometimes they will drive by, but seldom will they actually go into the property. Because remember, this property is distressed in some way, pre-foreclosure, or it's going to be an REO. So they may not want to go out at all. But what they do is they look at simply the highest comps possible and they put that together for the lender. Again, I mentioned that the lender typically provides forms that need to be filled out, which require the highest closed comparable sales in a subdivision or general area of the subject property. But all of those comparable sales have to have been listed on the MLS, no for sale by owners. These price estimates rarely contain any condition information, and often the interiors of the properties are not reviewed. When we had the problem with every piece of metal inside a house being stolen by metal thieves, oftentimes a BPO would come in at full market value and the inside of the house was trashed. So if you're going to get a BPO done because you're looking at a short sale, for example, you have to say to the agent, when's the BPO going to be done? I'll make an appointment and meet the BPO person there. That's the time to ask them to submit your contractor's estimate of repairs with their estimate of price. Otherwise, the bank's going to think, frankly, that it's the nicest house on the block and the most expensive. So CMAs are called Competitive Market Analysis, and these are unique. This is a report similar to a BPO. It's done by a realtor, except it includes active listings as value examples. So in other words, let's say there's 5 comparable closed sales, but there's 7 or 8 listed properties in the same neighborhood. Those prices are what I call wishful thinking. They haven't closed because they haven't been able to sell at that price. But what the agent does, he goes in and he says, here's what we have. Here's your competition. The purpose of the CMA in reality is to sell the listing agreement to the property owner. The most successful agents are the one who can make the best case for why you as a seller should use them as your listing agent. Nancy and I put a home up for sale a few months ago, and I would say the first day we got 43 or 46 phone calls from agents. Every one of them said, all I need is 10 minutes of your time. I'm not going to sell anything. I just want you to view what I have. And we actually were so curious about what they were trying to do is we said, make the appointment, come on out and see us. And we just really almost had to have a baseball bat to beat them off after about a half an hour. And their point was, let me have the listing. We sold the property in the first 6 hours. What's interesting to me is, this is 6 months later, I'm going to say, and we're still getting phone calls from investors who think we still own the property. So if you're calling on expired listings or canceled listings or whatever kind of listings you got, make sure that the person that owned it before still owns it. It hasn't changed hands. What the CMA does is essentially focuses the owner on an even higher anticipated market value than he can receive, only if he signs the agent's listing agreement. One of the things we try to do is say to the agent, look, you have these cash buyers you're talking about, bring them in, and if we agree to a price, we will sign an agreement with you. And their answer was, we can't do it that way. And the reason was, apparently, from their side of the story, is other sellers had done that and never paid them a commission. Once again, the estimated values do not take into account the condition of the property, as the agent has seldom seen the property before he actually goes in to make his presentation to the seller. This is one of the big changes in the marketplace in the last 2 years, I'm going to say. Because if that listing agent wears 2 hats, one of which is I'll list it at the highest price I can get. I have pocket buyers, I have international buyers, I have all these cash buyers. Just sign the agreement. He can also say, oh my gosh, it's not in the condition it has to be in to get full market value. Why are you selling? Biggest question, most important one in the world. The answer is, I have a time problem. Something's going to happen. For convenience sake, I want out, whatever it is. Then you can sell the idea that you have cash buyers who are investors. You can use the word investors, and they will pay cash, close quickly, so on and so forth. That's how you become a hybrid agent, where you become an investor and a listing agent, get paid on both ends. Other than knowing what other listings are in the area, this valuation can be very, very misleading. In your mind as the seller, your assumption is, he's telling me he can get me even more money. And if you were thinking about it, you'd say to yourself, well, why haven't all those sold? Most people don't think about it. They focus on what's coming to me. What can you do for me? Automated valuation models. Now, one of the ones I'm going to mention shortly is Zillow. When Zillow first came out years and years ago, and I'm going to say I think it was like over 10 years ago or more, I called Zillow up and I said to them, guys, I really like what you're trying to do. Your valuation models really don't work very well. I love your valuations because if somebody asks me what it is, I can show your valuation and it's like 20% over the real market value. But nonetheless, I'm calling you to see if you will allow me to advertise on Zillow. They said, advertise? We never thought about that. Of course, now it's an advertising machine. That's all it has been doing. When they finally came back to me and said, we like it, and we will allow you to advertise for investor properties on Zillow. I said, great. How much is it going to cost me? This is a long time ago, and their answer was $30,000 a month. Well, that was the end of that. So at any rate, as I mentioned, companies like Zillow, Trulia, and Trulia is owned by Zillow, Redfin, and other websites have proprietary property appraisal systems called automated valuation models. Redfin, I want to mention while I have it, if you're going to look at online sites that give appraised values or market values, call them the same thing. Redfin typically has a lower and probably more accurate than Zillow, Trulia, or Realtor.com, and so on and so forth, just so you know. These companies have spent millions of dollars for their proprietary software, and they can be really very wrong in those estimates. Now, each company's estimate will be completely different. I showed on a webinar before how much different they can be. I chose one property, used 60 online appraisal like Zillow and Redfin and so on. The only one that was even close to any of the other ones was Trulia with Zillow. Now, they're owned by the same company, and they were different values. How much? $238. How could it be different when it's the same company using the same round-off errors? It doesn't matter. My point is they all use the same things to get to the same value. Why are they so much different? We're going to talk about that. These estimates should be used as a guideline and nothing more. Very important, and here I'll show you a very good example. As you notice, this is sold for $65,000. Well, that property was purchased at $40,000 and resold for $65,000. And if you notice carefully, Zillow showed an estimate, a zestimate of $322,245. And it sold for $65,000. Well, it sold in the first place to the investor for $40,000. This was about 3 weeks ago. As most of the people listening to this know, there's like a land rush now, which is typically the end of a market rise, but with interest rates so low, it could go on for a while. But it's cheaper now to build a new home than it is to buy an existing one. And new homes and ones that have been fully rehabbed are blowing away because people want to take advantage of low interest rates. And it's cheaper in many cases to get a mortgage on a property now than it is to pay rent. So the difference was the zestimate, again, was based on a completed home in the neighborhood. And this was the sale of a vacant lot. So if you're thinking to yourself, why didn't they know the difference? All of this software that they use is dumb software. They talk about artificial intelligence and things like that. The reality is it all comes down to making decisions based on the same subset of data. Here's an interesting point. One of the most well-known online home appraisals, which is Zillow's estimate, they claim that a current median error rate of 4.5%. Okay, but here's what happened. Spencer Raskoff, the co-founder and former CEO of Zillow, sold his house in 2016 for 40% less than the zestimate. Why? Not because he had to sell it, but because the zestimate was way off. When they started out originally, they would give a value to the land per square foot and at the same time talk about what the value of the structure was. That's why I say they always came out way too high. Here's kind of an industry insider secret. The automated valuation models are often using the county's tax assessed values as their actual value estimate instead of the AVMs. Now, how do I know that? Recently, one of our students handled an auction for 15 properties, multifamilies and single-family homes that were rentals. One-time auction, all 15 properties. A 1031 exchange, all the money came out and went into another project. So the issue became, Dave, I've been looking at these things and I'm going blind, and I keep getting all these different value estimates for the same properties. So he said, would you mind just evaluating? Give me what you think is market value in these things, so we know where to start the bids or have reserves for each of the properties. So I spent probably, 40 minutes going through the 15 properties, and I gave him the list. And he came back and said, wow, those are really different from some of the ones I had. Some were higher, some were lower. Ultimate result was they actually started all of the bids at the prices that I gave them. Maybe I was lucky, or maybe they liked my prices better. It doesn't matter. There's a certain skill level with actually making those offers that software can't do. So just to go through them quickly, the top 10 online property value estimating services are Zillow, Trulia, Redfin, Realtor.com, Real Estate ABC, eAppraisal, and I want to mention eAppraisal for a second. Years ago, I'm going to show it to you coming up here in a slide or something, I would do my FSBO power selling sale, and we would have hundreds of people come through, and out of those hundreds of people that would come through, they're not open houses, they're trustee ordered sales. That's what it said on the sign. So everybody coming in thought, man, I'm going to pick it up for nothing. They didn't. They overpaid for the properties. That was the biggest issue. We couldn't get appraisals after that because they were bidding against one another in a round robin auction. But people that came in would say to me, did you get an appraisal? And I'd say, I didn't get an appraisal because I knew what was going to happen. These guys were bidding against one another. I couldn't get an appraisal for that price. So I went online and I started shopping for appraisals online. eAppraisal was one of those companies, and for anywhere from $15 to $45, just put in the property address, it would hum a little bit, come back, print out this either stupidly low appraisal or magnificently high. Of course, I'd take the magnificently high one and say, yeah, here it is, just got it. eAppraisal was one of those services that gave a really nice high appraisal. Now they've been taken over, and what they do is they give free appraisals. The idea being they sell those leads to agents in the area because the average FSBO property is on the market for either 4 or 5 weeks before the seller decides, I'm out of here, I need an agent to show the property and do everything else. HomeGain.com, Chase Mortgage Services, Remax, and finally ForSaleByOwner.com. ForSaleByOwner.com is an interesting business because it's just a giant real estate agency that advertises properties. When you say, I want to sell my property by owner, they send in a representative to find out what level of sales exposure you want. They vary from low to full-blown their own service, 6% commission or 7%, whatever. So it's up to the seller, but effectively what they are is a lead generation for FSBO property sellers. So online automated appraisals, which I just mentioned the appraisal for you, they're of 2 types. The first one is listing agents advertising for unsuspected owners who are thinking about selling. So you go on there and there's all kinds of FSBO, sell my house, I want to sell my house myself, whatever. And what they are is they're lead gen services for listing agents. And most often you don't actually get a value, but rather a call from the agent who did the advertising, and then he's going to come by and see you to sell you on his prowess of how he can do better than anybody else in the industry. If you've heard me talk about iBuyers before, these are also included in this subset of valuation models. And the second type, of course, is actual paid appraisal websites that charge a fee and deliver you an appraisal in minutes. And if you understand the quote, rare as hen's teeth, because hens don't have teeth, that's what's happened to these websites, the appraisal websites. They're now generation sites for realtors who are looking for FSBOs before they actually get to the market or another agent gets to them. The reason to use these sites, the actual e-appraisal websites, is what I mentioned before. If you have an open house, I wouldn't suggest an open house, but a FSBO power selling system, when you do that, your prospects may ask for an appraisal because they think, I don't know what price is going to sell for, but it's going to be too high. Do you have an appraisal? The answer is, yeah, I just happen to have one here. These sites I mentioned before are harder and harder to find because everyone is giving the free estimates. How do you compete with free estimates if you charged for them in the past? What you do is you actually reverse and you say, come and get the free estimates, and they have to capture your information, obviously who you are, the address of the property, and they may even ask you that fabled question, by the way, why are you selling? So again, I'm reiterating it because I got ahead of myself, I guess. These sites actually do better by selling the leads to local agents than charging for the e-appraisal. It's common in a rising market like we've had for some investors to keep their lead generation programs in effect, but they understand that because of the competitiveness of the market at times, they do better by selling the leads than they do by being in competition with other people. And I'm seeing more and more of those services. What they do is they have massive pay-per-click or marketing advertising on the internet because it's generic in the sense that it can be Florida, Georgia, Alabama, or any other state. They have an efficiency of getting leads in that people, for example, in Broward County might not have. They're trying to focus all their effort on leads just in Broward County. Oh, by the way, the leads typically run somewhere between $40 and $750 for a lead. Now, a lead simply means that that person, that seller, has answered a questionnaire on the website of these guys, and they're selling you that lead. Oh, wait, how can something like that cost $700 or more? Long Island, New York. That's what they go for there. So I want to talk about the next source is data consolidators. These are investor services. A sample, as we know, would be REFX. There's others that have been put together by national real estate gurus for themselves and for their students. They now make more money providing data services than they do on getting new students. But they all have specialties, I'm going to say. All these service providers have slightly different add-ons and benefits. I don't know of anyone that has all the benefits of every one. These features include the abilities to do mailings and postcards, skip tracing service, a CRM or customer relationship management tool, and importantly, stacking filters to find motivated sellers. If you haven't heard me talk about stacking, it's very simple. Pre-foreclosure, non-owner occupied, pre-tax deed sale, listed or unlisted. All 5 or 6 of those can be put into public record, IDX data, and you'll come up with a list of people that are facing those circumstances right now. Those are all motivating factors. Don't be misled by the fact that they should be motivated when they aren't. Many of them wait until the last minute and lose their homes because of it. The important aspect about the data consolidators is they calculate the ARV using the same comps but different calculation methods. They use one of two, either average or median price. I'm going to give you two examples in a moment. The software, without any human help, can miscalculate values because it is a dumb software. I say dumb. It only knows what's going into it. Garbage in is garbage out. I oftentimes get comments, the information on my data consolidator software is terrible. Well, look, it's coming from the public record. It's coming from the clerk of the court. They all use the same data sources. There's one group out there that sells all of that data, and they're able to buy it, put it into their program, and then resell it to you. So how bad is it? Well, the only thing that you don't have most often is the speed of a property that's been either listed or sold on the MLS. Because the MLS is live and instant, and the data consolidators may not get the information as quickly. Some of them actually have joined every board of realtors in the country, and their data is almost instantaneous, while others scrape the data from the IDX or they buy the data from a delayed service. It puts it out, but it's not as quick. I think the thing I have to say here is if you're interested in quick data, go ahead and become licensed. But the quick data of the sale and stuff is hindsight. The only way it's going to help you, I'm going to talk about it coming up in a few minutes, is can you use that quick sale for something that you're doing? If you have a property that's listed for sale and you want to get a higher price than anything else in the neighborhood, the only way you're going to do that is to get an appraisal based on a closed comp that's already happened. It just hasn't been put in the public record yet. Again, I say this, we're going to cover this later because I'm going to show you the difference in the average and median and how much it can mean to you. And then one other thing I say is the investor offer. I also call it a Hail Mary. And why do I call it a Hail Mary? It's because I deal with investors day in, day out, sometimes in the evening. And the question becomes, how do they appraise the property? How do they know what after repaired value is? And believe me, it's a Hail Mary in many cases. Sometimes I'll get an answer that says, REIFAC says that the market value is $245,000. It has to be. Why does it have to be? Because REIFAC says that. REIFAC, by Francisco, the owner's own admission, is probably 95% accurate, which in the realm of data isn't bad. Is it perfect? Can't be. Absolutely can't be. And the reason being is when you look at closed comparable sales, they can be in other neighborhoods. They can be of many different qualities that are not apples to apples on the comps you have. We're going to talk about those. Simply because too many investors check only one or two sources and don't agree with anything else that's lower in value. What do I mean by that? They come to me and they say, I want to do a hard money loan on this property. I'm able to buy it for $70,000. I know it's worth $350,000. Oh, okay. Why? Well, because look at this comp. Now, that comp is on the other side of the street where every home is $350,000. On your side of the street, in that subdivision, every home is less than $80,000. Yeah, but it's just across the street, and well, it might as well be in another state. It's not going to happen. So what you need to do, if you're going to have to use the market value or the ARV, mostly because you're going to be a rehabber, you need to be accurate about what you think the real value on the resale is going to be. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. I said this, but I'm going to say it again. Too often they do not compare apples to apples since they can't see how the rehab was done or its cost compared to the comparable properties that they have. What's the difference here? Well, for one thing, if you can't see the kitchen in the comp you're looking at, you don't know if it has a new kitchen, $10,000 kitchen, $40,000 kitchen. You don't know if they've added bedrooms, baths, or whatever else inside the structure, so on and so forth. So just because you get a value per square foot and you multiply it times your value doesn't mean that's the value of your property. I did a fishing trip in the Keys. I was invited by a boat builder, the type of boat that I had at the time, to do a contest in the Keys. And I stayed at his house in the Keys. The way you get around not being able to get building permits is you buy a simple structure, whatever it happens to be, run down, torn down, dilapidated. It's a 1-1, 400 square feet. And by the way, I'm just going to add on to it. So that's what he had. I stayed in that 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, 500 square foot bedroom is what it was. But it was a main house at one time, probably back in the 30s. But it was nicely renovated. But he built on a 1-1 that was 2,000 square feet. 2,000 square feet, 1-1. And I said to him, boy, you did a nice job on it. He said, yeah, I got it in just a little over $300 a square foot. I about lost it. I didn't go crazy with him, but we're used to spending $20 a square foot, $30, and you'll see these numbers coming up. But $300 a square foot, hey, it's what you want. So when I do transactional funding, I constantly get these stories of how much more the property is worth, as I just said. And it's either because of the listing agent or another wholesaler, or they themselves came up with this value. And it's like starry-eyed. Very oftentimes it's what I call realtor speak. I saw one the other day. A realtor says this can be worth as much as $450,000 when you do the rehab. Now, I admit it was a very extensive rehab, but I looked to see what the other comps in a 2-mile square radius was. The highest comps in that 2-mile square radius was a little over $300,000. Where's the agent getting $450,000? I don't have any idea, but it's a great sales tool if the person listening to the agent believes it. I say this all the time, and I'll say it again. Remember, sellers are liars and buyers are liars. Some of these are in the absolute extreme. A $70,000 listed property that I mentioned before is on the market for 170 days, and the investor is telling me it's actually worth $350,000 after the rehab. Would I do a hard money loan on 60% of the $350,000? So he can walk away from the closing with $100,000 to do the rehab purportedly. My question to him was, if it's worth $350,000 and you're getting it for $70,000, why hasn't it sold in the last 170 days? Common sense is not so common. You would think that after 170 days, somebody in the business that's a rehabber or an investor who's local to that area would certainly have gobbled it up. What happened? It wasn't worth the $70,000 or it would have been sold. One thing I like to look at is the price history, and more importantly, see how many times it was actually pending a sale and didn't close. That's very telling of the price. You can get the pending sale history on Zillow or Realtor.com. I'm not sure if Realtor has it, but Zillow typically has it. But it's very telling about whether or not that property is everything that's being sold as. The result is simple. If they can't re-wholesale it or profitably rehab it, the deal dies. How long do you wait for the deal to die before you reduce the price? One of the students in Central Florida got a property under contract. He made an offer at $74,000. He came back to me and said they accepted my offer. It was listed for $120,000. Yep, had been listed for $120,000 for 2 years. They finally went down to $115,000. Why? Well, every time there's a price decrease or a new listing on the MLS, it triggers autoresponders. I don't know if that's the reason he looked at it, but when I looked at the property, it wasn't worth anywhere near the $75,000 that he had offered, so he had to pass on it. It was a property built in 1928 that probably had been abandoned since 1929 in pretty bad shape. The other possibility is the investor does the rehab anyway instead of giving up the property, and the rehab doesn't work because he assumed the after repaired value was something above what he could actually get. I'll talk about the other things that go wrong in rehabs in just a moment. So what do these evaluation models have in common? Very simply, they all look at closed, comparable sales. The idea being if it can close, then somebody's willing to have paid that. I once got a phone call from a guy in California, and he said to me, will you buy my home? I said, well, tell me about it. He said, well, you don't have to pay me anything. I said, what do you mean? What's the story? He said, well, you don't have to pay me anything. As a matter of fact, I have 3 of them. And what had happened is in one of the very nice neighborhoods of Fort Lauderdale, there was some rundown properties, a number of them. These investors moved in, bought the properties, went out to guys like this unsuspecting and said to them, look, here's the deal. We own too many properties, can't get any more credit. What we'll do is if we can use your credit, we will pay you $15,000 at closing. And when we sell the property, you're going to get 20% of the profit. Properties are going up like crazy. Here's our history of what was fictionalized, but nonetheless, he bought into it. They closed on it. He got his $15,000. What he didn't understand is he actually signed a deed in the package of materials that he was signing. HUD statement, so on and so forth. And the deed went to them. So now they were on title. Their agreement further said that don't have to worry about the mortgage you're going to have on the property because we're going to rent it and we're going to use those rental payments to pay the mortgage. So you'll never go into default. So why was he calling me? Because he went to buy a car. And when the guy ran his credit, he said, you're in foreclosure on 3 properties. He called me and said, please, just take them off my hands. And what that turned out to be was they owned 14 other properties the same way. It was a giant scam. I think one of them got 20 years in prison, but it wasn't long enough for all the damage they did. The properties are within a given area or neighborhood. The best, obviously, are in a subdivision or same neighborhood, not crossing into other boundaries. The easiest are condos. They're all in the same building, and they all pretty much trade at the same price within a specific time period. In other words, the comparables go back to usually 3 months on the minimum to as much as 1 year. Comparable square footage, plus or minus 10% of the subject property you're looking at. That's a variable rate. If you can't find comps, you can change that to plus or minus 25%. The idea on shifting these parameters, going back less time, subdivisions, square footage parameters, you can't find a comparable sale. So what do? You start tweaking the guidelines and the parameters to get a square foot number that you can multiply times yours, which can really be very misleading. Comparable beds and baths, you'd like to see a 3-2, comped against the 3-2, so on and so forth. Comparable lot size. I get this story all the time. I have a double lot. Okay, what you need to do is ask the question, is the house in the middle of the lot, or is it on one side of the lot where you actually have two lots? If he says it's in the middle, in his mind that means, boy, do I have a big yard. In my mind, what that means is, boy, do you have a lot of lawn maintenance. And that's it. Can't do anything else with it. But if he says it's on one of the lots and I bought the other lot separate, whatever, now you have the opportunity to buy it's oftentimes one folio number now, and then split the lots at the sale, and you'll have whatever your profit was on the single family home. You can then make another profit on the second lot where a developer will come in, or a contractor, and build on it. Comparable age. This is one of the most misleading parts. When any of the data consolidator services look at the properties, they don't look at the age of the property. So you can have a 1929, what we call stick houses or frame houses, compared to a 2011 concrete block house because they're the same square footage. But obviously they're not the same. And more of these parameters you can customize. You can go crazy customizing all sorts of minute parts of what your subject property is looking like compared to the other ones. People spend hours doing this, and the value of it is virtually zero. I'll talk about why coming up. What you don't see with these comparables that you're playing with is the remodeling job that's been done by a rehabber, and the question is whether or not he actually made money. There's a misleading guideline I see gurus use all the time. The average investor on his rehab makes $62,000 by this government statistic. The statistic says that an investor bought a property at $200,000 and then sold it for $262,000 on average over and over again. How many of those actually made money on the rehab? Some of them did not, probably a third, believe it or not. And of the other 2/3, how much did they make? They had to put some sort of cost into the property to rehab it. So that's very, very misleading. So here, if you're going to go and look at comps where they're in the same subdivision and you sort of got them narrowed down, look for any of them to check and make sure if they had been listed before. Is there any pictures online? A property that Nancy and I bought 2.5 years ago happens to have the same pictures on it from 2.5 years ago. And every once in a while I'll see a student or an investor come in. I look at the pictures online. Nice property. Looks like it's been staged. And I say to them, did you take pictures? And they say to me, yeah, I'll send them over to you. They send them over to me. There's nothing in the house. The people probably pre-foreclosure stripped everything. Kitchen cabinets, metal, anything they could get out. So the pictures can be very misleading. So let's talk about what about doing these things to help your comps. And I say help your comps for this reason. If you're going to be selling a property retail, you've gone through and rehabbed it, what about including properties that have sold but are not yet recorded in the public record? In other words, in a lot of these subdivisions that are really hot, they lay stagnant for years, suddenly they become popular and they start to have sales like fairly quickly, one behind the other. You know they've sold. The people who are there are coming in. The sellers will tell you what they sold it for. The incoming people will tell you even what they paid for it, because you can say to them, I would like to know, if you wouldn't mind telling me, how much you paid for your property. It's going to be in the public records within a day or two, but I'm curious because I have a home for sale. And when Nan and I did that, we were selling our rehab properties. If you do it nicely and approach the people that are the buyers that have moved in, they generously, and sometimes too generously, will share with you not only their HUD statements, but their complete closing file. And that has their social security number and all kinds of stuff in it. All you need to hear from them is $345,000 or $680,000 or whatever the number is. So now you have an idea of that property sold for that, mine's for sale. How does that property compare to mine? And it will give you just a guideline. What can you say to a buyer? That property down the street sold for $345,000. You're going to see it in the public record. It's not as nice as mine, so that's why I'm asking $375. Remember also that as property values have gone up as much as they have and as quickly as they have, if that buyer says, I'll take it for $375, that's the good news. The bad news is if he says to you, I'm getting a 100% VA loan or 95% something else loan, you're not going to get it financed in most cases because you can't get an appraisal based on MLS closed comparable sales. That's the parameter that lenders that are federally licensed have to go through. They can only take certain comps. They can't do FSBOs. This can be dangerous to assume, you see how I spelled assume, that when you've completed your rehab, you'll even get a higher price because of the unrecorded sales. I'm being cautious. Having rehabbed for 25 years and done a god-awful amount of homes, you err on the side of caution rather than closing your business down because you didn't do it correctly in the first place. I mentioned this, I was going to say it, here it is. Many variables can kill this dream, such as interest rate increases, appraisal values, labor issues, competitive new builds in the same area that you're in, and the cost of money to carry the completed rehab. These particular nightmares sometimes happen 2 or 3 at a time to a rehabber. So he's got to be able to buy the property, get into it, do the rehab quickly and efficiently, the lowest possible price, but still do a good job, and market it and get out of it. If you're one of those guys and you market it through a listing agent, you don't have to do that. And if you haven't learned that yet, you need to go ahead and figure out how to market your own properties, because 3% on 200,000 times you do 10 of those a year becomes a lot of money that you don't have to spend. What about looking at active listings that haven't sold yet? So in other words, here you are, you're trying to make the highest possible price in the minds of the buyers. Why don't you do the CMA? Why don't you look at those active listings that haven't sold yet? Again, I mention this only when you're the seller of a rehab property. Okay, when you're selling a wholesale deal, your effort to intimidate buyers with outrageous comps and dreams of high unreasonable prices will most likely hurt your future efforts to sell to some buyers. Those some buyers are typically what I call whale buyers, guys that come back and buy over and over again, hedge funds, so on and so forth. And I'm saying this because new investors in particular put a property under contract. They have visions of grandeur about what it's going to sell for. They can't sell it. They either have to give it back or they lose their earnest money deposit. They can't close, and so on and so forth. The point of this exercise I'm going through is to hone down on what you should be doing instead of spending a lot of time on after repaired values, market values, and so on. So let me go into the average versus median value of comparable sales. This is the forefront, the foundation of how all values are calculated. So what we're going to do is assume that within a half-mile radius of a subject and fictitious property, there's 14 qualified closed comparable sales. I'll mention something here very quickly. When data consolidators talk about a half-mile radius of a property, you're thinking a circle. It's not. It's a square. It just happens to be for software programming purposes and ease of thinking of what it looks like. It's actually called a radius when it's not. It's a half mile on each side of the square. So let's say the seller is asking $180,000 for his property, and further assume that the comparable sales in the target radius look like this: 100,000, 120, 75, 90, 200, 220, 45, 190, 65, 105, 225, 85, 175, and 90,000. 14 comps, all within a half-mile radius. Now, if you're saying to yourself, well, gee, what if they're in another subdivision or they're right across the street? Remember, unless you designate where they're coming from on the actual software dashboard in the program, it doesn't care. It's going to take all of these into account. So here's what you do. If you average these numbers, I've done them for you, they come out to $127,500 after repaired value. Now remember, he's asking $180,000. So this says market value is $127,500. So let's move on to the median value. Now this is calculated by dropping the highest and then dropping the lowest price to converge on the median value. Obviously, the more comps you have, the better this works, as well as with averages. The more you have and the closer the area, the better they work. I'll show you that in a moment. But here's what we have. Median value would be, and here's how I put it together, drop 225 and drop 45 at the same time. 220, 65, 285, 190, 85, 175, 90, 120, 90, and you come down to, you're converging on 105 and 100. Remember, there's 14 of them. So you come out with two numbers left. So what do? You average the two numbers, and you have an after repaired value of $102,500. which one's more accurate? Well, the computer software doesn't know any better. So if you're using a median value data consolidator, that's at least closer to what the guy's looking for. If you use an average, it's going to come out significantly different. Could be higher, much higher if you have homes that are in the 500,000 or 600,000 in this layout. But let's talk about accuracy. So here's what are more dramatic in terms of comparable sales. 7 properties at 300,000. Now again, half-mile radius, 7 and 7, and 7 of the properties that are 100,000. So your final average price would be 7 at 300, 7 at 100. Average them together, you got a $200,000 market value. But there's no homes for $200,000 in the $100,000 side. So your data consolidator is saying $200,000 for the home you're making an offer on for 100 or less. Now, this is what I just said to you, but again, there's no homes on one side for less than 300, guarded gated community, and none on the other side for more than 100. So if you calculated a median value rather than an average value of 200, it would come out to the same $200,000. Why? Because you converge on the last two numbers, which are 300 and 100. Average those together, you get 200. Now, is this stupidly simple and it never happens? No. Ironically, it happens more often than you would believe. Here's where the art of valuing a property comes into play. The investor has to hone down on the subdivision where the subject property was and then compare apples to apples. Sounds pretty simple, right? But remember, most investors who go in to make offers are not looking at subdivisions and so on. They're looking at the bigger picture. My software said this, make the offer as a percentage of that or as a maximum allowable offer, or whatever method you're using. And in fact, it could be very much wrong to begin with. Why don't we compare it to the listed price? Because the listed price can be even worse. Many agents will sell the concept to the seller, will list it high, and all we have to do is drop the price until somebody buys it. That sounds good, but in the real world, dropping the price taints the property because every time the price is dropped, it brings the autoresponders out of the woodworks for a price reduction so new agents can come back and look at it for their buyers and so on. So it's actually a place to look for deals because they're getting more motivated. But if they started the listing price well above market value, it's not going to help anybody until it gets to a price where it'll finally sell. I said this, or I alluded to it before. The micro comparison of comparables can only be done if the investor can see what the inside of each property looks like. And that's unreasonable in most cases, unless it's been listed on the MLS recently. For example, one property has the original mid-century kitchen and bath and sold for $250,000 in a specific subdivision, while another property with the same square footage sold recently, same subdivision, for $350,000. Why? Well, simply because the $350,000 property had been rehabbed. Oh, that's, gee whiz, Dave, that's pretty obvious. The updates on the $350,000 property could have cost $150,000. Just because you see the pictures on the MLS, Realtor.com, you can't tell how much money that investor put into the property. You can tell, however, how much he paid for it. What the investor sees is the $250,000 property with an after-repaired value of $350,000, but not realizing it may cost him $150,000 to do the same updates or more. The investor buys it with starry eyes and puts only $100,000 into it because he's running out of money and finds he can't sell it at $350,000. Why am I belaboring this? As you know, my thing is wholesale, wholesale, wholesale. It's very simple. I see too many rehabbers that go belly up after their first, second, or third property. And I'm trying to say to you, if you're going to do this, do it right. The result on these could be a solid loser. There's one of my students who is a very successful wholesaler and a very unsuccessful rehabber at the same time. He uses his gains in wholesaling to offset his losses in rehabbing. And if you're thinking to yourself, he must be stupid, he's not. He's pretty smart. But he just does not have good luck rehabbing because he doesn't, for whatever reason, it doesn't work for him. He actually hired a consultant, a management consultant. He came to me after the fact and he said, I paid this consultant from Tampa to come over and look at my business. And for $10,000, he told me I need to stop rehabbing. And I said, I told you that 2 or 3 years ago when you started rehabbing. So let's talk about the case where there are no comps at all or very few. And some of these areas where, for example, in Palm Beach, each comp might be a half a mile or a mile away and there's only one of them. and the houses are not comparable. So what happens if you get the best and biggest house in the neighborhood as a comparable and they split it into cost per square foot, multiply it times your square footage in your house? Is that the same? Well, if you find a ravenous buyer, you're not going to be able to get an appraisal for your buyer, who will likely be getting a loan, so no sale. The closest comps are over a mile away. Most programs, data consolidators, will allow you to step out to get more comparables. But are these really accurate? Oftentimes they're not. Ultimately, as I mentioned before, all comparisons come down to the dollars per square foot of the comparable properties times the square footage in your property. Remember, I mentioned gross and net before, another very important factor to look at. Too few or no comps in the area, or for the last few years, no properties have sold. You're flying blind, and you could be in for major problems of selling it. The neighborhood is very mixed with older and newer properties. This is becoming more and more common, so the comparables you're looking at are 2015 or 18 versus 1932 and 1949. They're not the same. Make sure the year built matches your property or close to that, or you could be in for a really big letdown. Easiest way to overcome these peculiarities is to get an appraisal and carefully compare it with the tax assessed value from the county. It has to be higher or something's wrong. And you can always use the appraisal when you have an open house or a FSBO power selling sale and a prospect asks to see it, very simply. So how does the ARV affect your offer on a property? When it comes down to it, what does it mean? If you want to rehab the property, your offer has to be very concise or you won't get the deal. Or you could lose money if you get the deal. So what's very concise? Very simply, it's your repair estimates, your time to do the repairs, and your ability to resell the property. As well as, oh yes, is your labor force stable? Are they going to come on time and do the right kind of work the first time? If you pay too much initially, you next face the hazards of completing the rehab and then not being able to resell it. For convenience sake, most rehabbers go to wholesalers to get their rehab properties. They don't want to spend weeks or months looking and getting turned down. They have to do their rehabs. That's where they make their money. So they turn to wholesalers. Very simple. In many cases, the wholesaler will make more profit than the rehabber at the closing table and will not have to wait 3 to 6 months. That's not true all the time. There are good professional rehabbers that are contractors that have working crews that have their own money or special rates for hard money, but they're seasoned and experienced in the business. If you're going to take on rehabbing initially, be very careful. First of all, if you know you're going to wholesale a property, you can make any offer. And if you get it, then you need to find a buyer, or you're not going to find a buyer. It's very straightforward and simple. So after all of this, what is the most accurate value of any property? You've heard me say this before, and I keep saying it every time I get it because I see it happen almost every day. It's only worth what you can sell it for and the amount of time you have to sell it. This is wonderful, and it's terrible at the same time. It's wonderful for wholesalers because they go in with little or no money, but it's terrible in the sense that the buyers know you have it under contract, you have an end of an inspection period as a deadline. So they literally can put it under contract with you and not close, and then go back to the seller directly. We have all sorts of ways to overcome those symptoms of what I call black hat wholesaling. How does the ARV affect your offer for a property? Frankly, as a wholesaler, your making offers is far more important than making the perfect offer. I don't want to repeat that again, but it's absolutely a truism in the business. If you're spending your time trying to find the perfect offer and not making offers, you're never going to get a deal. If you make offers, as stupid as some of them can be, or as low as some of them can be, you will get deals eventually. You may get very tired, you may get very frustrated, but there will come a time when you hit a deal. The issue with doing it properly is to be able to reproduce it and have a consistent income, rather than wild swings, so to speak. So there's two ways that wholesalers work. The general wholesale offers are made either too low, they're going to be rejected, or too high, or they're going to get accepted in many cases. Too low means the offer is a safe percentage of market value less your estimated repair cost, and it's designed to be rejected. That's the bottom line. For you people who have never done this before and you're saying to yourself, well, that's stupid, you're never going to get one, 95% of the deals that our students do come doing exactly that, so you know ahead of time. That's where they get their deals. Listed deals. Many gurus will tell you there are no deals listed on the MLS. Too high means you offer close to market value, knowing you can't possibly resell it, and you go for a price reduction later. That's how most wholesalers do it, whether it's listed or not listed. Offer too high, get it under contract, don't worry about it. Now what happens? They don't close because they may not get a price reduction. That's wonderful for wholesalers who offer too low. Why? Because now they've spent 30 days trying to get a buyer for it, trying to get a price reduction. They cancel the contract. Now you have a more motivated seller, more motivated listing agent, and then you come in. And ultimately you can be the last man or woman standing to get the best possible price that you can get. This too high an offer strategy is exactly what boiler rooms of investors and iBuyers are doing, including OfferPad. They go in, they know they're not going to pay that price, or they're not going to go to the closing table. OfferPad, for example, has a 10% acquisition fee, a seller's agent fee, and then they come up with the rehab fee, which can be any open number. So when they go in and they offer close to what market value is, because they've determined market value, they know when the seller accepts their offer, they're not going to go away without a profit, or they're not going to continue and they'll cancel the contract. Let's look at the 3 most asked evaluation questions that I get. How do I make offers on multifamily properties? How do I make repair estimates? How do I calculate an offer for raw land? So what I'm going to talk about is fast offers. Let's get these things done quick. For rental income properties, not single-family homes that are rented. Rental properties are bought and sold based on their net rental income after expenses, net rental income, divided by their purchase price and rehab costs to the buyer. This is called a cap rate. Here is the fast offer calculation for income properties. Typically in the industry, they'll give you 3 to 10 sheets of paper. They say fill out all these little numbers about the property, and then we'll work our way at the end towards a cap rate. I remember one landlord telling me he had a 23-page Excel spreadsheet that he used to calculate the perfect cap rate. My answer is that's great until you have a repair. Then your cap rate's going to change because now you have more money in the property. But let's do it so you can make money by buying and wholesaling rental properties. All that's needed is the gross monthly rental income, or GMI. Well, Dave, wait a minute. This has 3 units, but one of them's not rented. Okay, we need a gross monthly rental income assuming they were all rented. So make an assumption about what the rent should be. Well, Dave, the rents are way below market value. What I want you to do is calculate what the rates are now, not what your expectation is the seller is telling you they should be. What is it now? Next, you choose what I call a divisor factor, which when divided into the gross monthly rental income will approximate the cap rate and reasonably accurate. If you're off by 0.5%, 1%, 2%, it doesn't matter. This is a fast offer calculation. You make that offer to a landlord, $320,000. He says, are you kidding? That's ridiculous. And your response is wide-eyed, gee, what were you thinking? My partner's the one that made the offer. So example, a quadplex yielding $4,000, gross monthly rental income, not taking into account taxes, maintenance, management fees, anything else, $4,000 a month gross income. If we divide that $4,000 by a factor of 1.8%, that's approximately a 15% cap rate, or an offer of $223,000, fast offer, boom. That's how long it takes you to do it. Now if you say to me, Dave, how did you get the 15% cap? I've said this before in meetings. Nancy and I have owned over 1,000 rental doors, 1,000, but never for more than 1 day. I wholesaled every one of them. To be able to come up with a method of fast offers, this is what I did. To be able to say, here's the offer. Now, I'm going to show you that this is an actual example. So if you divide that $4,000 by 1.8%, not the annualized monthly rental income, not all these things the other guys do, just the gross monthly rental income, I would make a fast offer of $223,000. Now, I have it under contract and I need to go sell it. What's the cap rate that's effective in the market now? It's 9%. A lot of guys would kill for 9%. If I divide 400,000 by 1.2%, that's a $400,000 offer price. That's my asking price. That's my listing price. How realistic are both of these numbers? I'm going to show you a recent example and tell you that this same thing happened to a student a year and a half ago. These same numbers, okay, except it was $399,000 instead of $400,000. What happened is I've been on a campaign. And the campaign basically goes like this. Because I do transactional funding and I see these properties come in, first-time investors, they have a property under contract and they say, I have a buyer. He's offering me $280,000. I have it under contract for $220,000. What do you think? And I say, I'm not here to think. What is it? Well, it's a fourplex yielding $4,000 a month income. Everyone's paying. He's rehabbed every unit. And he said to me, I will not take less than $220,000. What do you think? I said, get the contract signed. Oh, there it is, fast offer. My offer would be $223,000. So he said, okay, you sure? I said, look, I'm doing the funding for it. So he said, there is one problem. He said, my buyer had to go into the hospital and he's not coming out for 10 days. Would you carry the property as an extended transactional funding for 10 days? And I said, I don't do that, but because you have it, let me see it. So I looked at it. These are solid brick, 2 duplexes on the same lot right next to one another in mint condition virtually. So the question is, why is the guy selling them for $220,000? It doesn't matter. The guy said he wouldn't take a dime less than $220,000. So I said to the investor, get the contract. So we closed on it. What happens 10 days later? The investor that offered him $280,000 comes out of the hospital and says to him, I drove by the property. I'm reevaluating my offer. I can't pay you more than $240,000. Now, he knew that the investor paid $220,000. He knew that the investor would have to close or he'd be carrying that property with hard money, whatever else. And he figured, go back and ask for price reduction. So he had not signed a contract with that particular end buyer. So he said to me, what do I do? And I said, here's what you do. I told him how to sell that property. And ironically, when you listen to this video, we will have closed on it the same day at $340,000. Is that a good deal? That's a 100-pounder. Those are life changers. If I had not been the transactional funder that carried that property for him, he would have simply have gotten a $20,000 spread less his closing cost. What I was saying about my campaign is when I see some of these deals come to me, what I've been doing is partnering on those deals, getting in there, closing on them, carrying them, and making those things into much larger profits than the investor would have ever seen otherwise. So let's talk about fast calculation of repair estimates, because you're not going to be able to go out and get a contractor or handyman to come in, look at the property, and go through all that. The only reason to do that is to get a contractor's estimate of repairs, which puts into the property high-end stuff, like impact windows, high-end kitchen, so you can go back to the seller and ask for a price reduction. So the estimate of repairs for a property can be grossly different for each rehabber who are looking at your wholesale deal. Some rehabbers have their own crews. Others hire handymen or contractors, and many do their own rehabs. So their cost for labor and materials is significantly different. All of these things result in different material and labor costs, as I just said. Don't try and convince a buyer that the rehab cost will be a certain amount of money, because you're setting yourself up for a liability, and it may not come in at that price. It may come in much, much higher. Your buyer will likely come back to you after signing your contract with these words: we looked at the repairs closer and we need a lower price. What is that? They typically tell you that very close to the closing, sometimes the day before. Well, it typically strikes terror in most wholesalers' hearts, because what do I do? Well, you can't find another buyer before closing. You don't have the money to close on it sometimes, most every time. So what do? You give them a lower price. You walk away with chump change. That doesn't have to happen if you do it from the correct perspective and knowing how to properly handle the sale. Now, you can refine these general estimates that I'm going to give you, but they're what I call fast and furious. And remember, your buyer is going to do his own anyway. So it doesn't matter how much time you put into him, how much money you put into him. Your end buyer is going to come back. Some of them will know they can do it for a lot less. Many of them will tell you it's going to cost them a lot more just to get a better price from you. So the first thing is what we call lipstick on a pig. That's very simply $2.50 to $10 a square foot. That doesn't include cabinets, kitchen cabinets, or vanities. It's patch, paint, maybe some flooring. So if you have a 2,000 square foot house, what I'm saying is the cleanup and everything else, patch and paint, could run from $5,000 to $20,000. And if you're saying to yourself, it couldn't run $20,000, well, you might be in for a big surprise. Moderate. This is $15 to $25 a square foot. Roof, air conditioner, moderate kitchen, cabinet, update, bathroom, same thing, paint patch, landscape, and total floor coverings. And finally, full-blown. That's $25 to $40 a square foot. Everything needed in the property mentioned above to bring it up to date, and even more money if you're going to make it irresistible. Years ago, I had a father and son come to me. They said, we have a software program that's making us money like crazy. I said, what are you doing? They said, we're buying properties at the auction. I said, okay, how do you know what the repairs are going to be? They said, we don't care. I said, really? That's pretty interesting. So you never go inside the house. Because in the good old days, I'm going to say to you, it was very simple to go inside a vacant house. You broke in, went in, looked around. It's called breaking and entering. And nobody really cared very much. That's not so much the case anymore. But they said to me, no, we have a simple solution for the repair cost. We assume that we can repair any house for $30,000. Well, that's a pretty big assumption. But with that in mind, that was their business model. And they were fairly successful at doing simply that. So these are fast and furious ways to calculate what your repair costs are going to be. And you can adjust them based on your history of actual ones you've done. Well, Dave, wait, there's a $10 one and there's a $15. What happens if it falls in between? Look, guys, don't make trouble for yourself. Those are excuses. Pick a number and have an idea. If you're going to rehab that property, you better get everything in line. Cost of money, actual materials and labor, and everything else involved. This is fast and furious to make sure that the wholesale offer you make makes sense to a buyer coming in. Okay, fast calculation of land values. How to calculate land values is the most often asked questions I get from new investors. Because of the rapid rise in real estate prices lately, more and more investors are buying a bright, shiny object called land sales, how to buy and make money in land, and they're also realizing that land is relatively cheap. How do you calculate the land value? So I have an idea, and that is that the county tax assessed value, whatever it is, because land values don't change dramatically, offer 50% or less. Oftentimes these properties have never had a structure on them, or they had a structure years ago and it was torn down, so they're vacant lots. So how do you know what it is? This is a guideline. It's as good a guideline as anything else. And as simple as it sounds, it works well. But make sure the land is buildable under the present county or city codes. When you drive through a neighborhood and you see the same sized house on and on and on, older properties, back in the good old days, the allowable lot width could be as little as 30 feet because the homes weren't that wide, they were long. Now what's happening is you can't build on a 30-foot lot. You have to have a frontage of 50, 60 or more feet. So what do you do with that unbuildable lot, so to speak? Well, if it's not buildable, as I mentioned with old downtown lots, particularly, the only buyers you're going to get for that property are the property owners on either side and behind the lot. And the way you do that is you get it under contract, go to the one on the left and say to them, bought the property next door, I'm looking to sell it. I've talked to your neighbor already, he's interested, but do you want to own a second lot to improve the value of your property and get the two neighbors competing against one another? Or don't close on it because you can't get rid of it. So if it is buildable, then prospect for a buyer by driving the neighborhood and looking for contractors and developers who have recently built new homes, single families, or townhouses. Building townhouses on the lots is the way to maximize the value. You buy two homes next to one another or three, and then you come in and get it rezoned for townhouses and you build 4, 5, or 6 townhouses in the same square footage. So this has been a general oversight, and what I tried to cover is the importance of market value, after repaired value. But the single thing I want you to take away with this is you're better off to make offers than spend too much time thinking about the exact perfect offer to make. Again, if you can't sell it, you have to give it back. If you make an offer and it's been approved, then you've offered too much. Even if you're sitting with a homeowner across belly-to-belly presentation, you make an offer and they say okay, it's not done. You haven't gone to closing yet. We just had one with a student where he made an offer on a probate property, half the probate property, for $35,000. Now, it's a $275,000 property, but there's 2 estates. He bought half of it for $35,000 before the contract was signed and before the closing that we went through. He asked the seller for a repair credit. He got another $10,000 off. So he bought half of the property worth $250, $270, somewhere in there, it depends on who's doing the evaluation, for $25,000. I'm Dave Dinkle, and I want to say thank you for joining us tonight. And I have this simple question you've heard me say so many times. Why not you?